The goal of any great TV show, whether it's a fun little sitcom, a bracing crime procedural, or a fantastical epic, is to keep its audience on its toes. Unfortunately, taking a leap of creative faith can also painfully backfire. So, with that in mind, I'm Ellie for Whatculture, and these are film and TV moments that went way too far. The origin of Han Solo's name. Solo, a Star Wars story. Though Solo, a Star Wars story ultimately turned out decently enough for a Han Solo origin movie that few people were actually asking for, its attempts to nudge the fan base with its elbow often ended up missing the mark. And this is never more apparent than in the laughably on-the-nose early scene where we learn the origin of Solo's surname. At the start of the film, Han signs up for the Imperial Navy as a flight cadet, and the recruiting officer asks for his surname, who his people are. Han simply replies, "I have no people, I'm alone," to which the officer curtly replies, "Han Solo." It's a movie prequel scene so absurdly spoon-feeding as to border on self-parody. Did we really need to know where Han got his surname? Couldn't Solo just be his family name? And did the reveal scene have to be so corny? If the recruiting officer simply wrote the name down, it wouldn't have come across quite so pandering. Tellingly though, this is apparently the very sequence which got the film greenlit by Disney's Bob Iger, which really tells you everything you need to know, doesn't it? Izzy's ghostly grief, Grey's Anatomy. Grey's Anatomy has a long history of slightly odd storylines, mainly where its unlikely medical cases are concerned. I mean, do you remember the guy who ate dolls? But the series was never stranger than when surgical resident Izzy Stevens started hallucinating and even sleeping with the ghost of her late ex, Denny. Now, this subplot as a whole isn't as bad as you might remember, serving as a really powerful and jarring exploration of grief and mourning, since Izzy blames herself for Denny's death and is seeing him because of the cancer that she's yet to be diagnosed with. But the length of it and its unsettling intimacy is far too odd to be as moving as it wants to be. Now, credit should go to Katherine Heigl and Jeffrey Dean Morgan for giving such a mismatched storyline the depth that they did, but Grey's Anatomy fans the world over will all likely agree that this reunion never should have happened. But hey, when a series has run for as long as this cult favourite has, you're bound to have a few duds in there. Jill's Sandwich, Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City may have hewed closer to the video game source material than Paul W.S. Anderson's prior run of Resident Evil movies, but it wasn't really any better for it. Some of the nods to the video games were fine enough, such as the words "itchy tasty" written in blood on a window, but there's an early one that left a lot of the fanbase cringing so hard it caused physical pain. When the STARS team members are hanging out at a diner, Jill Valentine snatches Albert Wesker's sandwich out of his hand, takes a bite, and gleefully says, "It's Jill's sandwich now." As any Resident Evil fan worth their salt will know, this is in reference to the hilarious moment from the original video game where Barry Burton saves Jill from being crushed to death by a trap and tells her, "You are almost a Jill sandwich." Within the campy B-movie loving context of the 1996 game, this line works. But in a glossy, relatively self-serious 2021 movie adaptation, it feels more like a corny obligation than anything. Ross makes a move on his cousin, Friends. Ross Geller is a nightmare person throughout the duration of Friends, a compulsive cheater who secretly dated one of his students and at one point pretended to be dead to see if anyone cared about him. But he was never ickier or more unlikable than the time that he made a move on his own cousin. Watching a movie with Cassie, Ross finds himself overwhelmingly attracted to his literal relative, so much so that he actually leans in for a kiss. And when she tells him off, "I haven't had sex in a very long time," is the apparently hysterical reason he gives for such a maneuver. A scene played for laughs with no repercussions, Ross's brief moment with Cassie is a step too far for Friends, and its otherwise silly look at the relatable foibles people get up to on the day-to-day. This doesn't happen, and it isn't funny. And another reason why we should never have been rooting for Ross in the first place. I mean, Damn Dirty Human, Planet of the Apes. Dialogue callbacks to vastly better films in a franchise have a tendency to come off as awkwardly shoehorned, and there are few examples more wince-inducing than in Tim Burton's 2001 remake of Planet of the Apes. In the 1968 Charlton Heston starring version, Heston's protagonist George Taylor famously shouts at an ape, "Get your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape," much to the ape's collective shock, and Burton couldn't resist but offer a flipped version of the scene in his remake, when fierce guerrilla Colonel Attar tells human hero Leo Davidson, "Take your stinking hands off me, you damn dirty human." Much as the late great Michael Clark Duncan tries to imbue the line with the requisite menace, this feels less like a cute remix of the original line than a listless repurposing of it. It sounds inherently clumsy and only exacerbates the feeling that we're watching an ersatz facsimile of a true masterpiece. Say what you will about the remake's infamous ending, and we've all said a lot about it over the years, but at least it was trying something totally different. The Mother is Dead, How I Met Your Mother. The setup is simple and actually quite beautiful. Ted Mosby wants to sit his kids down and tell them all about how he met their mother. Granted, it's a long-winded story that takes 9 seasons to tell, but at its best, How I Met Your Mother was a wonderful little show, aiming for a hopeful, romantic conclusion. Also, we thought. In the finale, Ted reveals that Tracy, the love of his life and mother to his children, has been dead for 6 years. And the only reason he's telling his kids the story of his life is because he wants their permission to once again pursue his long-time on-and-off girlfriend, Robin. It's a jarring, cruel development that undermines the entire nature of the show before it, making Tracy a footnote in her own story so that Ted can emotionally manipulate his kids for a relationship that frankly never worked in the first place. Tracy deserved better, and so did the fans who invested in a happy ending. Hallucinations of Billy, Scream. In the legacy sequel tradition, of course, the 5th Scream film introduced a new protagonist, Sam Carpenter, who happens to be the daughter of one of the series' original killers, Billy Loomis. And because that wasn't enough nostalgia bait, we were periodically treated to Sam experiencing hallucinations of her father, with a decades-old Skeet Ulrich getting back into a blood-stained white shirt to taunt Sam. Even if you can ignore the not great digital de-aging applied to Ulrich, it's a wholly goofy conceit that doesn't exactly handle the concept of mental health with nuanced consideration. The Billy hallucinations were one of the more divisive aspects of the 5th movie, enough that they were toned down considerably for Scream 6, even if Billy did still briefly appear. While it's fair to say that the original, now scrapped Barrera-starring iteration of Scream 7 would have probably seen Sam conquer her demons once and for all, the very idea of putting Billy on screen posthumously just feels misguided and at odds with the overall tone of the franchise. Deb's in love with her brother, Dexter. Dexter was a show rife with brilliant rug pulls, from the death of Rita to the true identity of the infamous ice truck killer. But it also had some awful ones, from the final fate of Dexter to this list's pick, Deborah, and her romantic attraction to her brother. In the back end of season 6, it's revealed that Deb is actually in love with Dexter, her adoptive brother and closest confidant, a fact that she relays to him in season 7. Carpenter, to her credit, sells the revelation as a powerful testament to Deb's fractured mental state, but the twist itself is too unearned and weird to make any sense. It does Dexter little favours, proving that after 7 seasons of killing serial killers, the series may have been losing steam. And though it's tucked away pretty quickly, it still leaves a rotten taste in the mouth, especially since Deb dies just a season later. Goldfinger, but oil. Quantum of Solace. Quantum of Solace is certainly one of the messier and more divisive Bond films, but not without its merits. All the same, reminding fans of another vastly better Bond film they could be watching instead, that just wasn't it. Midway through the movie, 007 discovers the corpse of the ludicrously monikered MI6 agent Strawberry Fields, who's been drowned in crude oil and left on a bed. This is very obviously a tip of the hat to Goldfinger, and especially the unforgettable sequence in which Bond girl Jill Masterson is killed by henchman Oddjob after he covers her body in gold paint, causing her to die of skin suffocation. Director Mark Forster's intent was good enough here to show how oil has supplanted gold as the most coveted material on Earth, but given the generally middling response to Quantum of Solace as a whole, you couldn't be blamed for checking out and wishing you were watching Goldfinger instead. Tig loses a daughter, Sons of Anarchy. Like several shows still to come on this list, Sons of Anarchy seemed to revel in the horrible and the nasty. It featured torture, bloody brawls, child kidnapping, and the cruel existence of doomed biker Otto after all. But it was never more heartless or needlessly cruel as it was to Tig in season 5. Now, Tig was no angel, but watching him helplessly watch as his daughter is burned alive by big bad Damon Pope will forever haunt fans of the series. Not only because Dawn wasn't innocent, but because the scene itself is so long, so grueling, and so viscerally inhumane. It goes on too long, truth be told, and the sheer unrelenting misery of it all eventually overshadows the meaning behind it, leaving it more gratuitous than anything else. Watching a terrified young woman burn to death whilst her defenseless father screams like a wounded animal will just do that to you. CGI Arnie, Terminator Salvation. On paper, Terminator Salvation had all the ingredients necessary to deliver a solid Terminator film without Arnold Schwarzenegger. That is, a gritty future war setting focused on the human resistance battling Skynet, with Christian Bale playing resistance leader John Connor. But the filmmakers just couldn't brave the concept of a Terminator film without Arnie. And because he was serving as governor of California at the time, a digital likeness of him was instead included as another T-800 Terminator which attacks Connor. Except the CGI Arnie looked horribly plastic and video gamey even for 2009 standards, and today it looks genuinely hideous. Given how digital doubles have come on leaps and bounds over the last 15 years, the movie might have gotten away with it were it made today. But the utter desperation to have Arnie's presence in the film by any means necessary only further contributed to the franchise's ongoing inability to stand apart from him. The death of Shireen Baratheon, Game of Thrones. Since we're all having so much fun talking about fiery deaths, here's another one from a show synonymous with taking things too far. Game of Thrones had it all. Assault, murder, incest, gnarly torture, you name it. But even it has a moment that went overboard, and that was with the death of young Shireen Baratheon. In a show of deplorable wretches and irredeemable monsters, Shireen was a rare, endearing presence, a wounded, kindly girl who loved deeply and was therefore, obviously in hindsight, doomed to a cruel fate. But no one could have predicted seeing her burned at the stake, a sacrifice by her father to help him win the war. Considering the fact that up to that point, Stannis had been shown to dote on his daughter, seeing him stare coldly while she burns and screams for release might just be the most hopelessly bleak thing Game of Thrones ever did. And of course, her sacrifice was all in vain, adding to its prolonged, almost unwatchable cruelty. Chris returns and loses her eyes. The Exorcist Believer. The Exorcist Believer wasn't merely content to be an aggressively forgettable legacy sequel, it also had to actively insult anyone who loved the original movie, enough that it's probably more apt to call it a fan disservice. The new Exorcist brings original franchise protagonist Chris MacNeil back for a small supporting role, as she attempts to help new hero Victor deal with the demonic possession of his daughter Angela and her friend Catherine. But when Chris attempts to exorcise the demon from Catherine stabs Chris's eyes with a cross, blinding her. It's an utterly miserable outcome for one of the most distinctive heroines in horror cinema history, and it goes without saying that giving a legacy character life-changing injuries in an attempt to lend more import to a thoroughly naff new movie comes off as overwhelmingly desperate. For Ellen Burstyn's part, she was totally upfront about the fact that she only appeared in the film because Universal agreed to fund an acting scholarship on her behalf. And so at least something good came out of this wreck. Robson's dental procedure, Oz. If there was any show that could rival Game of Thrones for title of most unsettling, it would be Oz, HBO's early masterwork that features more horrible human behaviour and graphic violence than almost anything seen on TV before or since. And this was one of its very worst moments, in an endless sea of them. After making a name for himself as a steadfast member of the Aryan Brotherhood, convicted murderer Robson develops gum disease and has a surgical graft to fix it. Learning after the fact that the graft was taken from a black man, distraught and removed from the Brotherhood, he takes a razor and decides to cut the gums out of his mouth. It's a sadistic, visceral scene, the prelude to which sees Robson using heroin as a painkiller before we're shown in vivid, zoomed-in detail his razor cut out chunks of his gums. Even for Oz, this scene was seriously twisted. Khan! Star Trek Into Darkness. Though broadly well received by critics, Star Trek Into Darkness endured a much harsher reception from ride-or-die Trekkies, who felt that the film leaned far too heavily on the legacy of the consensus best Trek film Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. For starters, Kirk sacrifices himself in a manner excessively similar to Spock in The Wrath of Khan, but of course it sticks for a mere matter of minutes before he's revived courtesy of Khan's magic blood. But the single moment that proved too much for many fans, when Spock helplessly watches Kirk die and angrily screams, "Khan!" Khan, just as Shatner's Kirk did in The Wrath of Khan. Yet the original Shatner scene had become so widely memed by this point that the reference completely threw things off in Into Darkness, especially in a scene that's supposed to be serious. Many of the film's indulgent nods or straight-up cribbing from the best Star Trek movie can be forgiven, but this was a bridge too far. Negan introduces Lucille, the Walking Dead. Fans of the Walking Dead comic series knew what was coming, though most were hoping it would be toned down for a TV broadcast. Unfortunately though, we weren't so lucky, and the deaths of Glenn and Abraham were every bit as bloody, over-the-top and grim as its source material. If you were to pinpoint the exact moment many fans turned on AMC's zombie hit, you need look no further than the moment Negan takes his bat Lucille and beats the holy hell out of Glenn in front of his pregnant wife, in a sequence that lasts about 2 grueling minutes. Too far indeed. Before the deaths of these two fan favourites, The Walking Dead hadn't exactly been tame, but it had relied on slight realistic touch and subtlety, leaving a lot of its nastiest moments to our imagination. With this, it leapt headfirst into merciless torture porn, making Negan a threat, but the series itself far removed from what it once was. Ghost Egon, Ghostbusters Afterlife. Though there's little doubting that director Jason Reitman's heart was in the right place when he decided to include a digital likeness of Harold Ramis's Egon Spengler in Ghostbusters Afterlife, it understandably rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. A well-intended tribute to the original cast's single dead actor, undeniably, but it's tough to shake the ghoulishness of digitally resurrecting a late performer in the pursuit of bolstering the audience's emotional connection to a movie product. At best, it's misguided. At worst, it's grossly cynical. At least Reitman was smart enough to feature Egon as a translucent spectre rather than a fluffy flesh and blood human, ensuring the VFX didn't need to pass the sniff test quite so thoroughly. Yet, on an ethical level, even accepting the evident approval the production had from Ramis's family, it seems tacky not to simply let dead actors, who themselves cannot consent to the future use of their image, rest. In a film packed wall to wall with, hey look, nostalgia bait, this was the single moment that well and truly crossed the line. Spike assaults Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Though it made sense to have Spike do something ungodly to hammer home that he's still a monster, having him brutally force himself on a wounded Buffy was definitely not the way forward. In one of the most controversial TV episodes ever aired, Season 6's Seeing Red, Spike tries to reignite his twisted love affair with this Slayer, and when she rebuffs him, he beats her down and starts to undress her. He's pushed off and crashes back to reality after seeing the damage he's caused, but by then, it's definitely too late. Spike would go on to have a staggering arc in Buffy's final season, but this moment still lingers heavy in the mind of the show's fandom, for all the wrong, traumatic reasons. And, spoiler alert, the fact that this was also the episode the amazing Tara dies only makes the episode that much harder to forget. Basically all of it, 13 Reasons Why. Now let's get this out of the way as bluntly as possible. 13 Reasons Why is a bad show that has caused more damage than any TV series of its generation. It reportedly wanted to look at the hardships of teenage life in America. Gun violence, sexual violence, love, addiction, friendship, suicide, depression, and all it really did was fumble at every turn. First of all, there's the infamous scene, since removed by Netflix, of narrator Hannah Baker killing herself in a bathtub, which would go on to be linked with a rise in youth suicide after its release. But this wasn't all. 13 Reasons Why also had school outcast Tyler assaulted with a broom, who in his trauma would almost commit a school shooting, dozens of instances of sexual assault, and a finale that mercilessly killed off Justin, a young drug addict who developed HIV as a last-second twist. None of this was handled with any kind of care, and in many cases the show's warm aesthetic and narration justifying its characters' decisions actually glamorized them. It was awful from the off, but 13 Reasons Why only got worse with time and did nothing to combat the troubling real-world issues it claimed to be fighting for its vulnerable audience. My advice? Stay clear.